In the final topic of Chapter 3, we're going to talk about margin for something called short selling. So let's see what short selling is. So technically speaking, short selling is selling shares that you don't own, so not owned by the investor. How do you sell something that you don't own? You have to borrow it from somebody else. And in this case, you end up borrowing it through the broker. And later, of course, if you borrow something and sell it, if whoever owned it wants it back, you're going to have to repurchase it and give it back. What is the point of this? The point of this is the investor, as an investor who wants to so-called sell short, and that's what this is called, they want to profit by the stock going down. Okay, so let's look at a little picture of this. I like to think of it as this way. When you normally, what do you do in the stock market? Normally, you hope the price is going to go up, so you buy, and you hope the price goes up, and you get to sell it at a high price, and you make money. However, what if it's the case that you think, I don't think the price is going to go up. I think the price is going to go down. I think it's going to go down a lot. Can you profit from that? The answer is yes, and short selling is the way you do that. In fact, the way I think about it, there's only one rule of markets, that's buy low, sell high, but it doesn't matter what order you do it in. So if you can sell high first, and that's a short sale, and then buy something back lower later, you still did buy low, sell high. You just did it in a different order. You just did it sell high, buy low, and you make money. Again, how do you sell something that you don't own? You have to borrow it from somebody else, okay? And it turns out that the broker facilitates that, makes it very easy. It's as easy as just clicking on short sell and the number of shares. And if those shares are available, they will loan them to you, you sell it, and then at some point in the future, you will have to buy it back. Is there any set time limit? No, in general, no. There can be some situations where those shares can be called in and you would be forced to buy them back and give them back, but lots of cases, there's no set time limit. Okay, so that's called short selling. Mechanics of this, I just sort of went over it. Let's say I want to sell shares short. What happens? I borrow the stock from the broker. That's like a loan. So in that case, I must post margin, and we're going to go through the margin calculations here. But that's the loan. Instead of borrowing money from the broker, I'm borrowing shares. Okay, so I borrow those shares, and then I sell those, right? I go through my broker and say, hey, sell the shares. So the broker sells the shares and deposits the proceeds in your account. Okay, now you can't touch that money. So you could imagine you tell the broker, hey, I want to sell 10 million worth of shares in Apple, and they borrow those shares and they sell it, and they get 10 million for it, and they stick it in your account. Do you think you can take that money out of the account, and take off and disappear? No. So when they sell those shares for you, they will hold the money in the account. That's essentially collateral against your short sale. So they will sell. The proceeds from the sale will go into your account, but you can't touch it until you've bought the shares back and returned those shares. So that is, you cannot withdraw the proceeds until it's called covering your short, when you bought the shares back and returned them to whoever they were borrowed from. And that's covering or closing out your position. You buy stock on the market, and then the broker returns it to whoever it was borrowed from. Now, this sounds complicated. It's done very seamlessly these days. It's as simple as going in and clicking on sell short and how many shares, and boom. And as long as you meet the margin requirements, and that's what we'll go over here, then it's no problem. Okay, so that's selling short. And here's some terminology. I think I've already slipped into using this a little bit, but now I want to formally introduce it. And this is the terminology of long and short, and this is commonly used in markets. And the term long means to buy. So if I'm long shares of Apple, it means I bought shares of Apple and I want them to go up. And if I'm short shares of Apple, what does that mean? I've sold those and I want it to go down. So this is important terminology. Let's compare and contrast these. If I say I have a long position in a stock, what does that mean? That means I bought the stock and I want it to go up and I'm going to have to sell later. This also corresponds to the terminology of being bullish on a stock. Maybe some of you have heard that. Or they'll talk about a bull market. If you are a bull on a stock, or there's a bull market, that means the market is what? Going up, right? And that would correspond to being long in a stock. You want the stock to go up. So they would say you're bullish. Okay? Contrast that with a short position. A short position is you actually sell first and you're going to have to buy it back later. If you are short a stock, then you are what we call bearish on the stock. If you are a bear or there's a bear market or you're bearish on this stock or that, you think that stock is going to go down. Okay? So that's very common terminology here, bull and bear. Where did these come from? Well, I've read that they come from the way the two animals fight, that a bull will try to flip somebody up with their horns and that a bear will strike down. So anyway, interesting terminology, but very, very common. So try to be familiar with the difference between long and short and what it means to be bullish or bearish on a stock or a bull or a bear market. Bull going up, bear going down. All right, once we have that terminology, let's walk through the margin calculations that go along with a short sale. And we're going to see here that they're very, very similar to the ones that go along with buying. Okay, and as long as we keep track of a nice little balance sheet, then it's no problem. So we're just going to walk through an example here. So let's say you sell short 100 shares of stock X at $60 per share. Okay, so when that happens, you sell 100 at $60 a share. That's going to generate how much? It's going to generate $6,000. Okay, so the broker is going to hold those proceeds from the sale, that $6,000 as collateral, but that's going to be sitting in your account. You can see it, but you can't touch it. All right, additionally, the initial margin requirement is 50% on a short sale. All right, here's the question. How much cash do you need to put in your account or to have in your account in order to meet that initial margin requirement? We're going to tackle this the same way we tackled being long. We're going to have a little balance sheet. And on the asset side, what does it look like here? Well, I have the $6,000. That's the proceeds from the short. Additionally, I have to have cash in my account. So I'm going to call that C. And this question here is how much cash, basically what does C need to be in order to have that initial margin percent of 50%. Okay, so I have that. On the liability side, what did I borrow? I borrowed the shares. So the shares are going to sit right there, 100 shares of stock X. And now we do our same calculations. What is account margin? Assets minus liabilities. Account margin is assets. What are the assets here? There's the cash plus the 6,000 proceeds, both of those are the assets, minus what do I owe? I owe the shares, 100 shares. How much are the shares worth? Well, 100 shares at $60 per share. Okay, you're going to see that's going to cancel out, and my account margin is going to start at just whatever cash was in my account. And that makes sense if you think about it, because I started with cash sitting in my account, and then everything else, it was I borrowed shares and sold them. That shouldn't change anything. So I start with margin of C, and then I have to meet that initial margin requirement, which is 50%. And so I calculate the margin percent, and it's the same formula as before. I take account margin, and I divide it by the market value of securities. But here, the only twist is that there are no securities on the asset side. What are the securities I need to refer to? They're the securities under the liabilities. Okay, so I divide by the market value of those securities. What's the market value of those securities? 100 shares at $60 per share. I need this ratio to equal 50%. I solve for C, and that means my cash in my account needed to start at $3,000 in order to meet the initial margin requirement to sell short. Okay, let's keep moving along. Part B, if the maintenance margin requirement is 30%, at what price will you get a margin call? Before we dive into this, and we're going to do it exactly the same way that we did it for the long case, we're just going to do a little balance sheet. But before we do that, let's just think this through for a second. If I'm short, what do I want? I want the price to go down. So the bad scenario for me is that the price is going up. So if I receive a margin call, that's a bad thing, right? That means I've been losing money. So this price, and this is what they want us to find, this price better be above the price that I sold for. Okay, that's the only scenario that makes sense. So that's sort of a sanity check. Now let's walk through the actual solving. So on the asset side, what do I have? I have $6,000. That's the proceeds from the short. I also have my initial cash that I had to have in there. That was the $3,000 from Part A. Liabilities, I owe the shares of stock. So what is my margin? So my margin is assets. What are the assets? 3,000 plus 6,000. That goes down there. That's the 9,000. Minus the liabilities. What do I owe here? It's the 100 shares of stock X, but I'm trying to determine at what price I get the margin call. So I don't know what the price of these shares is right now. So I'm going to put that as P. Okay, but that's what I owe. I owe those 1,000 shares at price P. So my account margin is 9,000 minus 100 P. Okay, now it says I'm going to hit the maintenance margin requirement. That's 30%. So I'm going to take the margin percent, same formula. Where do I get that from? I take the account margin. That's right there. We calculated that. That's the 9,000 minus 100P. And I divide it by the market value of the securities. Again, the securities are sitting in the liabilities now. How much are they worth? Well, I don't know. I'm trying to determine that price P, but I have 100 of those, so their value is going to be 100P. And now I want to know at what price P this equals 30%. I'm left with an equation here. I need to just use some algebra and solve it. If you go through the algebra and solve that, what do you get? You're going to get a price of $69.23. Okay, let's see if that makes sense. Is that above the initial price of 60? Yes, it is. So that means the price was going up. When I'm short, I want the price to go down. It was going up. I was losing money. That's why I got the margin call. That's my margin percent went down to 30%. All right, now let's hit the last step here. Let's assume you get the margin call. So the price hits 69.23. Let's remember that. And let's assume that I get that margin call. How much cash do you need to add to your account to bring it back up to the initial margin requirement? So the broker contacts me and says, hey, we've got a problem. Your margin percent now is only 30%. You need to bring it back up to 50%. Okay, otherwise we're going to sell you out, or we're actually going to cover your short, and we're going to get our money back. All right, so how much cash do you need to add to your account to make it margin compliant at the initial margin requirement, which is 50%. All right, so let's look at our account now. Assets, that's 6,000. We had 3,000 initially in cash, plus now I'm going to have to add some more. I'm going to call that C. That's the cash that I'm going to add. What do I owe? I still owe the 100 shares of the stock X. All right, so what is my account margin? Account margin is always the same, assets minus liabilities. So these are the assets now. It's 3,000, 6,000, that's 9,000, plus the cash that I'm going to add, minus how much do I owe? Well, I know I just hit that maintenance margin requirement, and from part B, we calculated that the price was $69.23. So the shares that I owe are worth this, 100 times $69.23 per share. So that is my account margin that's sitting right here. And I need to bring my margin percent back up to the initial margin requirement, which is 50%. So I calculate the margin percent. What is that? That's account margin. So again, I take this value here, which is the 9,000 plus C minus 69.23. And I divide it by the market value of the securities. Where are the securities? They're sitting right here. What is their value? 100 shares at 69.23 per share. I plug that in there. And I want to know when this equals 50%. I need to solve for C. I solve for C, and this is the amount of cash that they would make me add to my account, $1,384.50. As long as I do that, I can stay in the trade because I moved it back up to the initial margin requirement. If I don't do that, then they're going to cover my short position, and I'm going to be out of the trade, and they're going to take those shares back. Okay, so this is how you do calculations, margin calculations for a short sale. All right, some final notes before I end here on a short sale. We had our balance sheet. We had assets and liabilities. There's a couple of other possibilities that can pop up on a short sale. So let's mention those briefly. When short selling, there can be costs associated with borrowing the shares. That's right here. You're borrowing the shares from somebody else. Okay, now there can be costs associated with that. What are the costs? If you borrow shares from somebody, and let's say you borrow shares of Verizon. Verizon pays a pretty big dividend. That person that you borrowed the shares from, they want those dividend payments. So you have to pay that dividend, okay? So that is potentially a cost. So if the shares paid a dividend, you need to add that to the liabilities here because you owe that. Okay. The other is there can be a borrowing cost. Some of the time you want to borrow shares of a stock and they say, hey, you're going to have to pay a fee to borrow those shares. You don't just get to borrow them for free. And so there can be basically an interest charge on borrowing shares to short sell. And once again, that's going to come right into there. So as you're doing problems, if they say, oh, it's paid a dividend of, I don't know, $100 or something like that for all the shares you borrowed, you would add that right into here. Or if it said there was a borrowing fee for borrowing the shares of, so much, you need to add that into the liabilities in an appropriate manner. And so that just changes that amount right there. All right, so these costs would be added to the liabilities. All right, so that was the final comment that I wanted to make on margin calculations for short selling.